Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start by presenting myself. My name is Walter Silva, and I'm a philosophy professor at Universidade Federal Rural do Rio de Janeiro, or translating in English, Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro. And well, I would like to start thanking immensely Professor Michael Ruse for having accepted our invitation. And this event is organized by the Associação Brasileira de Estudos de Ética Integrada. If we can translate in English, it would be something like a Brazilian Association of Studies in Integrated Ethics. And I would like also to thank Iago Pereira, who invited Professor Ruse directly. And Iago is in fact the CEO of our association. So it's an honor for us to have Professor Ruse today. Professor Ruse is one of the biggest names in the field of philosophy biology. And today, Professor Ruse will present some ideas he has been working on in his most recent writings, especially, I think, in his paper, Evolutionary Ethics, The Wrong Road Taken, and in his book, A Philosopher Looks at Human Beings. I don't know, both of them are going to be published, I think, not a long time from now. And then after Professor Ruse's presentation, we will have some time for questions and debates. Okay. And for those who are watching this event at YouTube, you can write the questions in the chat. So I'm gonna present Professor Ruse. Professor Ruse was born in Birmingham, England, and as I said, he's one of the fathers of the field of philosophy of biology, which we can say is a branch of philosophy of science. And Professor Ruse taught at the University of Guelph in Canada for 35 years, and now he is at Florida State University. I'm going to present a small list of some of Professor Ruse's books, starting with the Darwinian Revolution, 1979, taking Darwin seriously, a naturalistic approach to philosophy. This one we have the Brazilian translation here that I have. 1986, The Philosophy of Biology Today, 1988, Biology and the Foundations of Ethics, 1999, Darwinism and its Discontents, 2006, Cambridge Companion to the Origin of a Species, 2008, Philosophy After Darwin, 2009, The Philosophy of Human Evolution, 2012, Cambridge Handbook to Evolutionary Ethics, who is edited with Robert Richards, 2017, and finally, I think, on this book on Purpose from 2018. So I think for now that's it, and we can pass the word to Professor Ruse for his presentation.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I should say, not only is this not a burden, it's a joy and a pleasure, because one thing I've always taken very seriously is the thought and the hope that what I do in English is something which would be of interest not just to Anglophones, people in Australia and that sort of thing, but also to people of other countries, other cultures. I think to a certain extent, I've been lucky with respect to South America, both Brazil and its Portuguese and the rest of South America and its Spanish. You remember you were told that my book, The Darwinian Revolution, came out in 1979. Well, as you know, or probably have been told, I think Franco finished in 1975, and I forget exactly when Salazar stepped down in Portugal, but it was around the same time. And I have a feeling that the professors at Spanish and Portuguese universities were, let's say, rejoicing a certain amount that now they were no longer under the, let's use the word oppression, if you like, heavy hand of these dictators, and were open to exploring all sorts of different ideas. And of course, evolution was a natural. So I've always felt that to a certain extent, I was the person who came in just at the right time. Now, having said that, I don't want to in any sense dismiss South America, because in fact, I think that I've sold far more books in South America, both in Brazil in Portuguese and the rest of South America in Spanish, than I've certainly sold in English. So for me, this is not just a pleasure, it's an obligation and a joy to be speaking to you people here now. And I'm very much aware that as an Englishman, of course, I'm speaking English rather than Spanish or Portuguese. The only thing I can take some consolation in is, of course, as we all know, God speaks English. So, in fact, I'm speaking the language of God, and I'm pretty comfortable with that. That's a joke, but I know a lot of English people who don't think it's a joke, who think it's true. All right, so what I want to do this afternoon then is talk about something which has certainly interested me, and I'm very glad to say is something which has been really quite controversial in philosophical circles, and not just philosophy of biology. They say any good idea, first of all, they say it isn't true. Then they say something along the lines, well, it is true, but it's wrong. And then finally they say, it is true, but we've known that all along. I think I'm getting to the point of it is true, but we've known that all along. What I'm talking about is evolution, and I'll talk about evolution generally in a moment, and morality. In other words, the question is, to what extent is it significant, is it important that we humans are the end product of a long, slow, natural process of development from blobs, and even before that, over the last 4 billion years? To what extent is that important with respect to morality? And now that we realize that morality, or at least the alternative, is either morality is something given by God, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, and that sort of thing, or maybe some kind of disinterested, and I use the word disinterest not to mean uninterested, but objective, set of moral rules, with a kind of Platonic forms which exist independently. 2 + 2 = 4, whether we like it or not, and we ought not kill other people for pleasure, whether we like it or not. So this is the, as it were, the debate. And what I've always felt as an evolutionist, as a very committed evolutionist, it seems to me the most important thing that we can know about us as human beings is that we are the end product of an evolutionary process. Let me straight away say, I don't think this is a bad thing. I don't think this means that we're just dogs or animals or that sort of thing. Yes, we are animals, but I think that we're very clever animals. And personally, I take pride in being the end product of evolution. So please understand where I come from. But I want to say, it seems to me obvious that the fact that we are, in fact, evolved animals has to be important to the way that we think about things, and in particular, the way that we relate to each other as human beings. I mean, I see Mara Bittencourt sitting there. For me, I mean, for instance, how should I relate to women? What sort of rules should there be? Should I automatically assume that, let's say, Iago as a male is superior to Mara as a female? Should I, in other words, automatically assume that the way I deal with things is obviously talk to Iago first, and then maybe if we've got time, I'll talk to Mara, but, you know, only, as it were, as a follow-up. And so this is the kind of question that I'm interested in. To what extent are we moral? To what extent is our morality something which comes from evolution? Now, the interesting thing is, philosophers got in. Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, in other words, 150 years ago. Immediately, people realized it was going to have something to do with ethics. And in fact, Darwin's second big book, The Descent of Man, which he published in 1871, Darwin does it, excuse me, Darwin does in fact discuss ethics in some detail. But immediately, the philosophical community felt threatened. And immediately they said, no, no, evolution's got nothing at all to do with morality. We accept evolution, but it's got nothing to do with morality. And you mentioned this paper that I had, The Wrong Road Taken. In 1878, the journal Mind, M-I-N-D, started. It's probably the best known philosophy journal in the English language. And in the first year, a leading philosopher called Henry Sidgwick wrote an article about evolution and ethics. And his firm conclusion was evolution has nothing to tell us about ethics. And this was taken up by a student, G.E. Moore, in his famous book, Principia Ethica, which was published in 1903. And Moore says, no, it's wrong. That evolutionary ethics commits, excuse me, what he called the naturalistic fallacy. And this is the way that it's been ever since. I started doing philosophy in 1960. And there were three truths, three unmistakable truths. One was, even the nicest boys only want one thing. Even the nicest boys, whatever they say, they're just interested in sex. Second, Americans have terrible table manners. The English always look down on Americans for this. You see, the English use a knife and fork to eat. Americans cut the meat up with a knife and then eat it with a fork. And the English, goodness gracious, Americans, the way they, and the third is, you can't get ethics from evolution. I was taught this in 1960. And it wasn't until, 10, 15 years later, I started to think a bit more about it. And I really did have a flash. At some point in the 1980s, I suddenly said, yeah, this is ridiculous. Evolution has to have something to do with our ethics. I mean, if I look, let's say, at Iago, what do I see? I see two things right here, his eyes. I see a nose. I won't ask you to open your mouth, but I'm sure if Mara opened her mouth, we'd see teeth. Oh, you do have teeth. You're not an Englishman and had all of them pulled out. And now the question I ask is immediately, why does Iago have a nose? Why does he have eyes? Why does he have teeth? And then I go to Mara and say, well, Mara's, yes, she's like Iago. They both got two legs. They both got two arms. They both got eyes and noses and teeth. And yet Mara, in many respects, is very physically different from Iago. I mean, Iago's got a penis, Mara doesn't have. And so, of course, the question, no, well, you can smile. Okay, maybe you don't have Iago, but I'm sure that Walter does anyhow. So what I want to say is, oh, I've lost you. Hold on. That's my trouble. I get so excited when I'm talking that Oh, there we are. Got you again. I get so excited when I'm talking, as you can see what I was like in class. Incidentally, I've been retired for 2 years now. I'm 82, so I'm allowed to retire. Anyhow, if I look at somebody like that, Iago, and I start to think, I mean, everything that I see about Iago is going to be a function of evolution. Why does Iago have eyes? Well, because it means that he can see, and he's going to be that much more efficient than somebody who's blind. Why does Iago have teeth? Well, because we don't just swallow the stuff down, as it were, in gulps. We put it in our mouths, we chew it, and then we swallow it, and it's more digestible, and so on and so forth. And of course, Mara, then when we get to the differences, and I ask, well, why does Iago have a penis? Why does Mara have a vagina? Well, of course, we get into reproduction, and we talk about this. And if we didn't have these things, we wouldn't be here. So, as I say, it seems to me, if you start to look at human beings, you're going to look at them with respect to the attributes, or what biologists call adaptations, which are good for them to live and survive and get on with things. Well, obviously, our moral behavior is a very, very big part of what we are. If, for instance, Iago, as soon as he entered a room, wanted to start killing people, you wouldn't be sitting on your bottoms right now listening to me. You'd be saying, oh, gosh, Mara, I'm going to go dash in. I'm going to tear her apart, or something like that. And the author's going to come along and say, no, it's me who's going to do it. So we're going to fight it out. And then Mara's going to say, get lost, and so on and so forth. So in other words, what I'm saying is our behavior and our attitudes are going to be just as much part of our biology as our teeth and our noses. Because if we don't have the right kind of behavior, the right kind of attitude, there's no point in being able to see or being able to eat things or something like that. It's terribly, terribly important. And of course, what biologists, or they're known as paleoanthropologists, tell us, excuse me, is that humans are rather interesting animals. We are not lions or tigers. And all this business about humans being nature-red in tooth and claw is simply nonsense. The way that humans survived after they left the jungle and left the apes behind 5 million years ago was by living in bands and working together. I mean, look, take Iago. He's a handsome lad, isn't he? But where are his canine teeth, the ones that stick out like that? Look at his hands. Show us your hands, Iago. Yeah, where are his claws? Where are the claws so that when he meets Walter, he can rip him to bits or something? No, we don't have those sorts of attributes. I mean, in other words, what we've got, the way that we went, is by being social, by working together. I mean, we're not that fast compared. I mean, I've got 2 little Scotty dogs, Duncan and Scruffy. If I go out into the field, they can run way faster than I can because I'm bipedal and I just don't have a hope of keeping up with them. So they're faster than I am. And all of the other characteristics. So the way that we're going to manage is by working together as a team. Not that I want to catch my dogs, but let's say we've got a deer or something like that, and we need to eat it. Well, we're not going to catch it by just chasing after it. But by working together as a team, we might, for instance, get that deer to go down into a gully where it can't get out, and then we can sort of move in to the kill. Or we can wear the deer out until it just can't keep up. And then, because we're bipedal, we may not be that fast, but we can keep going a long, long time. We can work that way. So in other words, what I'm saying is that if you look at humans, it's not just the physical attributes that we've got, but it's also the social, psychological attributes that we've got. And of course, language comes into this. Anyhow, so as I say, it just seemed to me obvious that morality had to be involved here. Because why would I work with somebody else? Why would I work with Iago? I mean, I come home, I'm tired I've worn out. I've spent all day chasing the deer, and finally I've come back with, you know, half a deer on my back. There's Iago there. Iago spent the day teaching young people how to build houses, let's say. I mean, in other words, you're not just sitting on your bottom doing nothing, you're doing something. Now, the question is, why on earth should I share what I've got here with Iago? I mean, why should I do this? Why? Maria's there. Maria spent the whole day making traps to make smaller animals. Why should I give Maria a chunk of this meat that I've gone and searched for? Well, because I give Iago something, I give Maria something, and in turn, I expect that Iago will give something to the group. Not necessarily immediately to me, but to the group. For instance, Iago, you spend all day long teaching the young people in the group how to build, let's say, a house, a shelter. Now, we know that we're going to get rain, we're going to get these sorts of things. So we need shelters. So in other words, you're doing something for the group. I give you some meat, you help the young people help to build houses that I'm going to go in when it's rainy, and Maria likewise. We've all got, so we're a group that work together. And morality is a powerful adaptation to teach us how to work together. In other words, I look at Iago and I say, oh, I'm tired, I'm worn out. He's done nothing for me all day long. He may have built houses or shown young people how to build houses, but it's nothing for me. I don't think I'll bother to give Iago anything. No, it doesn't work that way. I'm going to say, yeah, Iago's part of the group. I have obligations to Iago to give that. And of course, Iago has expectations. In other words, Iago did not mind spending the whole day helping young people to build houses rather than go out on the hunt himself, because he knows he's contributing to the group, and that when I come back, I'm going to say, Iago, here, share this haunch of venison with me. In other words, and this is how morality works. It's not just a question of good feelings, it's that sense of obligation. Now, why would people be against this? Well, as I say, it's really rather frightening to think that morality is only a question of, let's say, adaptation, emotions. And the weird thing is, we could even imagine a group which had morality, but it wasn't our morality. Suppose, for instance, we hated each other, like the Americans and the Russians in the 1950s, the Cold War. I hate you, Iago, because you're Russian and you're trying to bomb me and that sort of thing. So I feel I've got an obligation, a moral obligation to hate you. But why don't I go in and kill you? Because I know damn well that you likewise have a moral obligation to kill me. In other words, here we are, as it were, prepared to fight like that. But I know if I go after you, I'm probably going to get killed. And if you go after me, you're going to. So better that we say, well, I don't like you, but, you know, let's get on. Let's get on. Not because we feel any niceness to each other, but because we're scared that if we don't do it, we're going to be in bigger trouble than we would otherwise. So in other words, what I'm saying is we could have a very different system of morality, which it certainly worked in the 1950s. I'm not saying it always would work as well, but you can imagine we might have had a different sort of morality. Or let's say, for instance, that Darwin has this example. Suppose we'd evolved like the bees, and we had Maria is the queen bee, and then we have all these little females like that, and then there's Iago and Walter and me, who are the drones, who do absolutely nothing all day. But when the courting thing comes, we try to outdo each other. But then when autumn comes, when it starts to get cold, instead of Mara turning to us and saying, oh, I'll feed you, she says, no, clear off, I don't want anything to do with you. Slam the door. And Mara, of course, feels that she's got to do that. She ought to do that, because if she doesn't do that, her colony won't survive the winter. they've only got a limited amount of food, and they can't afford to give it Iago and Walter and others like that. So in other words, we could have a very different sort of morality there. So in other words, what I'm saying is not that morality doesn't exist, but that morality is a kind of adaptation, just like everything else. I mean, let's go back to Iago and eyes. Well, we know that if Iago spent all his time not outside, but in underground, in caves and water, like that sort of thing, there might, so in other words, he's not using his eyes. There might well be pressure to lose those eyes, or at least, and of course, we know that animals that live in caves and that sort of thing often are very short-sighted, because having eyes gets irritated, and so in other words, they're far from being useful, they're a bad thing to have. So what I'm saying is it's all relative, that sort of thing. Doesn't mean to say it isn't important. And of course, the thing is, we have to believe that it's objective. If I thought, for instance, I'm going to give Iago food, oh no, I really don't, then I'd start to cheat. I mean, that's what I do. But I can't cheat. Why? Because I say, oh, I don't think I'll bother with give Iago. And then I'm going to go home or go to bed, and I'm going to say, oh, by gosh, don't I feel a shit? Don't I feel just awful? I haven't played. Hey, Iago, I'm very sorry. Here, have an extra piece. Have some of mine too. And that's how morality works. Because although it's subjective, we have to think that it's objective. And so you've got this extra bit like that. I mean, Iago can say, well, you know, I personally, I prefer, let's say, I'm a bit of a vegetarian. I prefer a good hunk of cheese rather than a haunch of meat. And that, you know, you could have that. But it's not a moral thing. Oh, I'm moral. Of course, some people make vegetarianism a moral issue, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, as it happens, I personally, I'm not a vegetarian, but I love a piece of cheese. I mean, I lived in France for a year. Oh, it was heaven. I mean, the French and their cheeses. I mean, I was in absolute heaven in France with all the cheeses. So I love the cheeses, but I don't think it's a moral issue that I was eating cheese rather than, let's say, bacon or, you know, pork chops or something like that. It's not a moral issue, but it is a moral issue. If I've got this, and I know that Iago, of course, don't forget, we look for cheaters. If we found that Iago isn't doing his bit, then one of the things we're going to do very quickly, particularly if we're in a group, we're going to pick this out. And we're going to say, Iago, you're not pulling your weight. Get on with it, mate, and do it. Oh, yes, Iago. And then we discover 2-3 weeks later, Iago isn't. He's still dicking off. He's still not doing it. Well, you know what we're going to do. We don't necessarily kill him, but one night, the rest of us get up and move off, and Iago wakes up in the morning. Where the hell is everybody? They've all gone. I'm on my own. Ah! So, in other words, we have these ways of enforcing morality. So let me. Oh gosh, once I start talking, I can't shut up. Well, as you see, this was why I was led very strongly to endorse evolutionary ethics. But it's not an objective evolutionary ethics. It's an adaptation. It's like hands and teeth and noses. It's a vital adaptation because we are social. And of course, now one final thing I'll say is, why aren't we social all the time? Why did Putin march into the Ukraine, for instance? Well, evolutionists have thought about this. And one of the problems is we're no longer hunter-gatherers. We no longer live in small bands. We now have agriculture and these things, which, apart from anything else, led to a huge population explosion. Think about being in a small band of 50. You can't afford to have half your band under 25. You can't. So we know there had to be a fair amount of infanticide for these things to work. But now, about 10,000 years ago, you get agriculture and things change because you need kids. Why? Because they can work in the fields. The more kids you've got, the better off you are when you're doing agriculture. So it switched. we had a huge population explosion. And of course, with agriculture, you've got, if you're a hunter-gatherer and you don't like the, excuse me, you don't like the next band, you just get up and walk away. But if you've got agriculture and you've got a farm with all these, vegetables and animals, you can't just get up and walk away. So in other words, the feeling is that an awful lot of what we do today is, as they say, we've got Stone Age minds in modern skulls where, we don't work properly. And let me end with this. Women were equal. When they were hunter-gatherers, women had to be equal. Because if they weren't equal, then we're all going to lose. Doesn't mean to say they're going to go out hunting, but for instance, they're going to make traps to catch the small animals. And there's certainly going to be no question about women being at least as clever as men. Because you have to be just as clever, if not cleverer, to make a good trap to catch small animals as you do to dash around, just wearing an athlete's support in the desert with a spear. So in other words, there was no reason for this. But then, of course, women got stuck, babies, that sort of thing. They got pushed into second class. But now, notice what's happened in the last 50, 60, 70 years. Women have changed this, or things have changed for women. First, we've had labor-saving devices, things like the Bendix washing machine. So Mara doesn't have to spend all weekend scrubbing clothes like my mother used to in the 1940s. By the 1950s, my mother could come home at the end of the week, she was a school teacher, and put the dirty clothes in the machine, turn it on, and then sit down and have supper with the rest of us. And on Saturday, she'd put them in the dryer, and then she'd fold them up and that sort of thing. And by lunchtime on Saturday, it was done. So that's one thing that changed. Of course, the other thing that changed was contraception. As I say, in the 1950s, when I was growing up, as I say, even the nicest things, boys only wanted one thing. But the tensions that were going on, because girls knew they couldn't just have sex, because if they got pregnant, you don't want to be an 18-year-old and pregnant. I mean, what are your chances of doing anything? Because with the pill, changed overnight, absolutely changed overnight. And anybody who's been a teacher as long as I have will know back in the 1960s, yes, there were girls in classes, but they certainly weren't a third, a quarter. But now, when I retired in 2020, women were at least 50%, usually 60 or 70%. My university, which is not a particularly sensitive university, over 60% of the undergraduates were women. And when you get to the graduate program, that's changing too, or changed. Certainly, if you go into areas like psychology or biology, women are more in there than men. So things can change. So I'm not saying they don't change, but as I say, everything's a function of biology. Well, I think that's enough for me. Let me take a glass of water. Oh, righto, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ruse. I'm use my power here, and I have I don't know, 2 questions that I would like to make, and then we can open for a discussion. The first one is that I read your paper that I mentioned, Evolutionary Ethics, the Wrong Road Taken, and you end the paper with somehow pessimistic feeling about philosophers being able to take Darwin seriously. And what I ask you, because as you said, you take almost 30 years of the articles published at Mind magazine, and as you expose almost all of them, or they ignore evolution or they are against it. And what I ask you is that if there really is a room for any optimistic view for philosophers to
I
accept
think
evolution?
that's a very good question, and I've thought about this, and certainly there are days when I don't feel very optimistic. I mean, given what Putin has done in the Ukraine in the last year, gives me very little ground for optimism. There was absolutely no reason whatsoever why he had to invade the Ukraine. It wasn't that the Ukraine were harming Russia. It wasn't that the Ukraine were, taking things from Russia. It was all a power struggle. He wanted to make a greater Russia and be the sort of, the Tsar Philip, the Great of Russia in the 21st century. And as I say, that I keep losing my, hold on, I keep losing it. Here we are. Here we go again. So there are times when I feel really rather pessimistic. On the other hand, there are times when I feel a bit better about these things. Look at the 20th century. Now, we've certainly had wars all the way through the 20th century, so no question about that. First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Iran, all of these things. However, think about it this way. The wars weren't equal. The First World War was absolutely horrific. And the number of people who died in the First World War is out of thing. I mean, there isn't a person in England who doesn't now, of course, they'd be great-grandfathers or great-great-uncles. There isn't a person in England when I grew up who did not have a relative who died in France. Horrendous. And then what happened? We had the Second World War with Hitler, Barbarossa marching into Russia and all, the fighting in the Atlantic, the U-boats and these things. And then what happened after that? They founded the United Nations. Now, obviously, the United Nations hasn't stopped war. But I think it's fair to say the second half of the 20th century was a lot less warlike than the first half. I mean, to take an example, Vietnam, 60,000 Americans died in Vietnam between, let's say 1965 and 1975. 60,000. The Americans entered the First World War in the middle of the summer of 1917 and fought there until, I think, November, the 10th day of the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month till November. So they were there fighting for less than 15 months. They lost 120,000 young men dead. I mean, I'm not talking about injured. So in other words, and we all know about Vietnam, but it turns out that Vietnam was considerably less slaughtering than it was in the First World War. So I please understand, I'm not being optimistic about it. Who could be optimistic, naively optimistic, given the Ukraine? On the other hand, look at the Ukraine. The England, America, all of these other, Germany, we didn't just dash in, as it were, with our tanks and our planes flying. No, we stopped and said, okay, how can we contain this? What can we do, if not to end it, at least to, as it were, give it some sort of form of semblance or something like that? So the answer to your question is, in certain respects, I am pessimistic, but in other respects, I'm not. And again, let's go back to the question of women. I mean, as I say, I have seen an unbelievable change in the attitudes towards women from when I grew up in the 1940s to today. I mean, my mother was a school teacher, so she wasn't just somebody who did nothing. But as I say, came the weekend, and my mother spent from Friday evening until well into Sunday doing clothes, washing things, hanging them up, all of these sorts of things. And then bingo, almost overnight, my parents bought a Bendix washing machine. They could afford to do so because my mother was a teacher, so they had a bit of money to do that. they bought a Bendix washing machine, and overnight, literally overnight, my mother was freed to, as it were, to start being a human being. And then, as I say, I started university teaching. I started university in 1959. I started teaching in 1965. And I cannot begin to tell you the difference between the girls of 1959 and the girls of 1965. The girls of 1965 weren't immoral or worse or anything like that. It was just, they knew they weren't going to get pregnant. They weren't going to get pregnant. So yeah, even the nicest boys only want one thing. Even the nicest girls only want one thing. But they couldn't have it in the 1950s. And then by the end of the 1960s. So I have seen some very significant changes in these sorts of things. So there is an element of, let's say, an element of optimism, although I think it would be very naive just to sit back and say it's just going to happen. I mean, even what we're doing at the moment, think of what we're doing at the moment. Here we are with television and that sort of thing. You can say, okay, we'll do a Zoom at 4:30 next Wednesday afternoon. Expect you to be there. Well, you could do that. And so look how you and I and others are able to have this sort of social intercourse between countries. So I'm going to go away. I mean, I've traveled in South America. I love the Iguazu Falls. They're not as good as the Niagara Falls, but there you go. But anyhow, I travel. So you once you start to do this sort of thing, you do get to be more understanding. And I don't, for instance, I would never, for instance, think of you, oh, well, they're just, Brazilians, or they're just Argentinians. Yeah, they're nice people, but not very bright. They don't really do anything very intellectual, do they? Well, I know that that's total bullshit. I know that you people are taking intellectual things like philosophy as seriously as we do in North America. So at one level, I am optimistic. But as I say, I think it would be very naive just to sit back and say, okay, it's all going to work out. No need to put any more effort in. Unless we keep at it, we're done for.
But I mean, specifically, when we think about philosophers, I mean, there is a lot of avoidance yet about evolution, especially in ethics, and in some sense I share the same mix of optimism and pessimism that you, but I tend to be more pessimistic about philosophers' capacity to take seriously evolution. I don't know.
Oh dear, oh dear. How old are you?
42.
42. And are you a professor teaching students?
Yeah.
So you go into class and you're 42 and you look at them and say, no, I think it's all terrible. I don't think there's anything we can do, blah, blah, blah. Come on, get on. Yeah, come on. I go out and have a, hey, how about you have a drink? How about before you give any class, you have a glass of wine or a beer, and then go in and be that much cheerier and more optimistic. I'm not saying be naively optimistic, but I feel that at least, I mean, that if you are, I mean, as a teacher, I think our most important thing is not just to pass on the information. I'm getting I'm getting something flipping in that I don't particularly want. It's not just the sort of the information like that. It's far more helping people to develop and to grow. I mean, any good teacher will tell you that's what teaching is all about. Yes, I'm going to teach you that Pythagoras' theorem, or I'm going to teach you Descartes' cogito ergo sum. But at the end of my teaching, what I want is to be able to say, I've helped these young people to grow, and to grow in the right way, to grow and have more moral sensitivity and these sorts of things towards others. I mean, there are lots of people in this world that we don't very much like. Well, part of being moral is to deal with this, is to say, well, I find you very difficult, but, you know, we're all in it together. Let's see if we can find a way forward. So, as I say, at some level, I'm professionally optimistic, if you like. And so you shouldn't talk to me unless I'm going to be there. It doesn't mean to say that every day I am. I mean, I think of the Ukraine and, oh my God, it's so awful, so awful. And it's all just Putin wanted to, as it were, to be Peter the Great of the 23rd century. I mean, there's no other reason. It's not as if the Ukraine was going to give Russia a great deal. And of course, it's backfired on Russia. That, you know, for instance, the first thing that McDonald's did was to leave Russia. Well, I'm not sure that having McDonald's is the most important thing in life, but I think a lot of people would feel, certainly my children, would feel that their lives are much deprived without the possibility of going and having a, you know, a Big Mac or something like that. So, as I say, it works both ways. But so I don't think there's any reason to be naively optimistic. And I mean, let's face up to it. Any country which elected Donald Trump as its president is not a country which is functioning very well, particularly as we know the person running against him was a woman. And let's face up to it, anybody who thinks that sexual prejudice had no role there is, you know, is just being naive, is just being silly. So, I mean, you know, that's what's going on. So it's always a balance. It's always a balance. But that's our job. I mean, you don't have to agree with me. You have to think of something else. But my feeling is that as a philosopher and as an evolutionist, for me anyhow, I've been able to make some advances on thinking about ethics and these sorts of things. And why we, I mean, I'm not, please understand, the last thing I'm doing is walking in and abolishing ethics. I'm not saying, well, women are just inferior, so we can use them as we want. And, I think killing, if nature read in tooth and claw, we're really just lions or tigers. So if I bump off Iago and can get away with it, that's Iago's tough luck. I mean, that's all there is to it. And I can now, you know, take off Iago's 2 wives and, you know, take them back to myself. Oh, sorry, Iago. I thought, aren't you a Mormon? I thought you had 3 wives, wasn't it? You were telling me before we started. Anyhow, you know what I'm saying. So, as I say, I do feel very strongly that the position I've got helps me, I think, to put morality in a context and to understand things when things don't work out. And when I feel tugs or pushes, and I say, you know, why don't I feel worried about this? Why? I mean, I hear that Walter is having an affair. Well, you know, why? I mean, why do I want to say, well, maybe you shouldn't, maybe it's not wise, but I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to get as het up as I might do if I were a stern Christian, an evangelical Christian or something like that. So I think, you know, you've always got these sorts of balances. And, you know, you want to stop and say, okay, I don't feel as strongly. Should I feel as strongly? Or is it the case, you know, that there are other considerations come in? Is it just selfishness by me? Because, you know, I have a lot of students I like to sleep with. So is it just a question of selfishness? So as I say, I think, you know, it's not a static thing. But of course, that's the whole point about evolution. It's not static. And so that's why I think it's all so very, very exciting, and why I am so proud to be a philosopher. I mean, apart from the fact that we're brighter than anybody else, and anybody who's a philosopher who does not think that they're among the brightest people on campus is a liar, because that's all there is to it. Philosophers are not modest people, but you know what I mean. So, as I say, but the point is, I think having the kind of moral position I have is one which helps me try to be that little bit more moral, to think about these things and to lay them out and to realize that these things are not given to us. Yes, they are, but they're given to us by our grandparents, great-grandparents, and all those, people who all the way back to the jungle. So we've inherited what these people have learned, and we've now got the responsibility to pick up and do our bit.
And yeah, my second question is, you mentioned this problem of the mismatch after agriculture, and do you think this is perhaps the main reason for our problems, thinking about morality, because we live in huge societies and we are not adapted to use our psychological mechanisms for...
Oh, I don't. I mean, I agree. I mean, let's face up to it. The society that we live in is so completely different from the society that people lived in 15,000 years ago. And we had evolved over 5 million years to, as it were, handle the kind of life that we had. The hunter-gatherer group, small groups. If there's any conflict, well, you just get up and move away, and all of these sorts of things. And so, I mean, and it worked very well. And now, look at us. Yeah, some things are good, some things are bad, and some things are very mixed. I mean, we now have, for instance, the ability to kill people in a way that 15,000 years ago we would never dream of. Atomic weapons and all these things. So the answer to your question is yes. I think that we are now facing all sorts of challenges that our biology did not suit us for. But, the nice thing is we do have biology, we do have intelligence, which is part of it. And so maybe we don't always do it well, but at least I think we've got a fighting chance. So that's how I feel about it. Now, I see that Matthias Dabnell has raised a hand.
Matthias, you can...
Yeah. Oh, thank you for your lecture. It was really good to hear you, Michael. Actually, I have a question regarding the debate about this subjectivity of moral values. And the question is like, does the conclusion that morality is subjective, does it depend on the metaphysical framework of naturalism? Why am I asking this question? Because I know that you work on the frontier on the debate regarding like creationism and evolution. And I know that there are a lot of different metaphysical frameworks regarding creationism. One of them is people from Biologos, for example, then like Francis Collins, Deborah Harsman, people like that. And they have a very high view of evolution, but they also have a theistic framework. And I think that these people would say like, okay, but this conclusion that morality is subjective is presupposing that evolution happens in a naturalistic framework, but that's the point that you are fighting against when you like say that the new atheists are making a conjunction between atheism and evolution. So does the conclusion depends on that framework? And if it does, should we debate this issue, like the metaphysical issue, before we reach any normative conclusion? Thank you so much.
Matthias, let's take this. I am not arguing that there is morality. I mean, I'm not using naturalism to say morality is all a scam, it's just ridiculous, and if we can get away without it, it's fine. In fact, I think, without showing off, I don't think you're going to find anybody more moral in those respects than I am. And certainly, I think I can give the Biologos people a good run for their money. I'm not saying I'm better, but I'm damn well not saying I'm worse. So in other words, please start with the fact that although I don't think morality exists out there, I do think that I am certainly very strong on morality. But now let's take the next thing. What is the Christian position on morality? Well, if you look at the Catholic position, which is the one best worked out, it says, well, what we should do is the will of God. God wants these things. Now, of course, in the book of Job, God, God just lays the law down and says, "I did it," like the little red hen. I sowed it. I tilled it. I reaped it. I baked it. I cooked it. I'm eating it. But I don't think most of us feel that way. So, but we are worried, I think. Well, if it's just the will of God, why isn't God's will, arbitrary? Why doesn't God say, "Oh, well, on Fridays it's okay to, to rape Maria and other women, not on Saturdays, but just on Fridays"? But of course, God, in other words, God says, "This is my will." No, you see, what the Catholics say is they have what they call natural law theory. They say that God made us in the way that we are. And once we're made in that sort of way, then morality follows. If God made us as men and women, then we're expected to have heterosexual intercourse, to raise children, and these sorts of things. I mean, it's all part of being human. If God made us this sort of way, I mean, take for instance our attitude towards children. Now, God did not make us, as it were, to say, "Oh, kids, out of the way, kiddo. I don't care. I'm just going to stamp on you. And, if there's any food going, I'm going to get it. And you'll just have to do without." No, God didn't make us that way. God made us love children. God said anybody, for instance, who ignores children and says, "They're not my bother," is unnatural. Unnatural. The natural thing is to love children, to care about children. So, in other words, if you think about it, I think that being religious does not necessarily mean you're not going to take naturalism very seriously. So, frankly, if I were a believer, I would feel absolutely no need whatsoever to change my philosophical position. Of course, if I were a believer, I would want to put it in the context that this is what God is doing. Obviously, that's what being a believer is all about. But if I were a believer, I would say, yes, this is the way that God made us. This is what God has made natural for us. God has made it unnatural, for instance, just to torment people because it's fun. It's made it unnatural to ignore the needs of children. Anybody, for instance, who walks past a pond where a child is fallen in and is in difficulty, anybody who does not stop and say, "Okay, what can I do? It's not my child. I've never seen the kid before." Anybody who does not stop and try and do something about it is unnatural. They're wrong. And I believe this, but why? Because it's unnatural. It's not what we do. And similarly, I believe, now, of course, it doesn't mean to say you don't get into difficulties. I mean, when we deal with something like homosexuality, is it natural for two men to have intercourse together? I mean, they're using their sexual organs for reasons that don't lead to reproduction. Well, as you know, discussions like this involve Christians as well as non-believers like me. And of course, Christians are working towards these issues and say, I think a lot of Christians, including a lot of Catholics, would say, well, it may not be for me, but I believe if people fall in love like this, and this is the way they are, they're not doing it, as it were, just to make a point. They're genuinely in love with the people. Who am I to say that they should not have a happy and worthwhile relationship and try to work these things together? Contraception is a good example. Pope Paul VI said contraception is a bad thing because it means that people just have sex for pleasure. Whereas I think a lot of people, including me, I suspect all of you, would say, no, contraception is a very good thing because it means that we can have sexual pleasure and build bonds, which are terribly important, but we don't necessarily have the worry of having 10 children. We can, in other words, we can have, I've got 5 altogether. My wife and I have 3 children. We're very happy to have them, but we're very happy not to have 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. So, as I say, there are going to be debates about what is natural, but I think that anyway. But as I say, in many very strong respects, I don't see the kind of naturalistic approach that I am taking is antithetical to a religious position. Now, I can well imagine some American evangelicals are going to say, no, it has nothing to do with you. It's all written there and God made it and that's the way it is. And it was God's decision and everything like that. But friends, I'm not an American evangelical. And frankly, I don't want to be an American evangelical. So that's where I stand.
Professor Ruse, I don't know if you have access to the chat. If not, I can read another question by another Matheus Coelho, and he asks you about your opinion on the work of Oliver Scott Curry, an anthropologist and cognitive scientist who proposed that morality is objective because cooperation and morality as a form of cooperation generate problems, and these problems are objective. How do we conciliate this view with the view that morality is subjective?
Well, I mean, obviously, as a naturalist, I think, if you like, things are objective. I mean, I think that Iago is a male is an objective fact. I mean, the fact that I learn about this through my adaptations doesn't stop it being the case that Iago is a male and that Iago has certain feelings. I don't think it means that it's not objective. That Iago, for instance, feels very strongly that we have obligations to small children, and that we've got that he's got obligations to small children that he doesn't necessarily have to me. If he saw me in the water, he'd be inclined to say, well, get out, friend, you know. But if he saw a small child in the water, then immediately he'd start to say, well, hang on, I've got to do something about this. So I see this as being objective in that sort of way. Of course, we're talking philosophically, and as it were, in that sense, is it objective in the sense that it's written in stone or something like that? The answer is no. But you see, I'm not sure that a Catholic natural law theorist thinks that. And a Catholic natural law theorist says God made us in this sort of way. That's objective, if you like. And from this, certain behaviors, moral behaviors, stem. But of course, at a certain level, it's as naturalistic, if you like. It's as naturalistic as anything I want to say, because that's, in fact, that's exactly what I want to say. I want to say, I mean, then I'm arguing with somebody about contraception. I want to say, I see it as perfectly natural to make use of contraception, particularly in our day and age and all of these things. I mean, for instance, don't forget, 200 years ago, you had 10 children, and the likelihood is that 5 or more would die before they were 5 years old. Whereas now, they don't. Now, you know, people by and large don't lose their children. And so I could well say that this alters the sort of situation that we're in and that sort of thing. So I'm not saying there isn't room for discussion and debate, but I don't see that I'm going to have the discussion and debate any different from somebody who's a Roman Catholic. I mean, you know, that's the way it is. Of course, I mean, let's be a little fair about that. I mean, Catholics, of course, do have the Bible, and they are going to turn to the Bible for advice. But on the other hand, let's face up to it. I don't think most Catholics today are going to take the Bible as absolutely. I mean, some evangelicals do. You take the question of women. I mean, the Bible, you know, St. Paul is pretty strong on women not saying anything. If men should do it, I think that most Catholics, a lot of religious people would say, well, maybe that was okay in the past. But it's not okay anymore. It's just not okay. So, as I say, I see the Catholics no different from me. I mean, the only people, as I say, who I think are different would be your evangelicals. I'm thinking particularly of America, who, as it were, take the Bible absolutely, but they don't believe in evolution. So there we go.
Okay, now, and Iago is asking you, what do you think about universal Darwinism, which proposed that evolution is an algorithm applicable to reality as a whole? Just
Well, I'm not sure. Universal Darwinism, I'm not sure that I find that a terribly helpful way to look at things. I mean, certainly I think Darwinism applies, but I mean, I'm not looking, for instance, at that picture you've got behind you, Yago. I don't think that's struggling for existence. I mean, you say universal Darwinism. I don't know what the bloody hell you mean by saying those books on your shelf are universally Darwinian. That, you know, one book is trying to beat out another book. And one book is saying, oh, I'm in Portuguese, you're in Spanish. Bahoo! I'm going to knock you on the floor and people are going to shred on you. I mean, yeah, if that's universal Darwinism, yeah, I'm not a universal Darwinian. But on the other hand, I think I made it clear that I'm a fairly strong Darwinian. So I'm pretty satisfied to be labeled a Darwinian without qualifications.
well, does anyone has any other question? Mateus, go ahead.
Yeah. One more question, Michael. Was really good to hear you about this. We are in a very delicate situation in Brazil right now. I think you know what happened.
Oh God, yes, you certainly are.
Yeah, sadly. And then you know
we've
that,
got, and don't forget, we've got the chap who's living in Florida now. You know?
Yeah.
eating hot dogs in Florida and having a nice beer. I know. Go on.
Yeah, you know, I wanna ask you about the situation. Like in Brazil in the last years, there have been a rise of the right wing, extreme right wing here, and there is extreme connection with the religion, like evangelicals and some Catholics as well are behind this race. And I was wondering about the like impacts of this extreme right wing regarding the debate about evolution and the way that things are going to go maybe in the future if the situation come back and get stronger, about the curriculum in the schools of Brazil about evolution itself, because you know people from evangelical background have a resistance, as you said, about on accepting the theory. And what are the ways, what are the steps that we could take as philosophers, intellectuals, people who work on this area, in this intersection, to like try to make at least an approach to these people, and show them that evolution is not tied specifically with anti-religion and something like this?
Well, Mateus, I can't speak to Brazil because I don't know it, but I think I can speak to North America and to England, certainly. It was the 1970s that caused all the problems. In the 1970s, up to the 1970s, you were a working class person. You didn't go to university. Probably you graduated from high school, and then you got a job at General Motors, say. And, you know, for the next 35, 40 years, you worked at General Motors. You got up, you started work at 8 in the morning, and you worked till 4:30 or something like that. You had holidays guaranteed, you had medical care, and you had a retirement pension. I mean, that's the way it worked. And then in the 1970s, two things happened. One, they started to outsource. People like Ford and General Motors started to outsource. So in other words, the jobs were lost. And secondly, of course, even when you bring them back, automation, think about how automation has changed things. I mean, the extent, I mean, we're now worrying, you know, in our business, aren't we, about artificial intelligence and that sort of thing. But certainly, you know, somebody working at General Motors who spent 40 years doing this, putting this in there, while it goes, and then the next one putting this. Well, of course, machines do that now. And so, in other words, they came back. And so I think the big problem has been the working classes losing their, what should we say, their meaning in life. And of course, what happened first was in the 1980s, people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were what they called neoliberals. They said, get rid of restraints and that sort of thing. Let business grow. And as business grows, so also people will get dragged along. Well, that would, you know, to use a technical term, that was total bullshit. I mean, yeah, businesses did grow, but what they did, rather than bringing people up, is they went in for more automation. And so, as it were, as they grew, and of course now what we've got with Brexit and with Trump is this extreme reaction of people, the lower class people, want to say up yours, you know, to middle class people like us. And of course, the trouble is, I'm middle class, and you know, despite all the worries, I'm pretty comfortable. I mean, before Christmas, I had pneumonia. So what happens? I didn't have to stay home with no help. I went to hospital, and I've just learned that my hospital stay cost $68,000. I'm paying 200. I'm paying 200 because I'm looked after. I'm looked after, and all of these sorts of things. And I can assure you, when we finish talking, I'm going to put the thing down. I'm going to say to my wife, you know, I'm so glad I did that, because for me, doing this is a tremendously important part of what I am as an academic, as a human being. So please understand, I'm not being preachy. I feel tremendously strongly about these sorts of things. But at the same time, what am I going to do? Is I'm going to pour myself a glass of whiskey, which costs $35 a bottle, and I'm going to have and I might have a second one. And then after that, I'm going to watch television and I'm going to drink wine. You know, so in other words, I'm really well off. But there's 50%, but if you like 40% of Americans who are not. And we've seen, for instance, in Buffalo, the terrible storms. But who were the people who really got hurt by the storms? I'll tell you, it was the black people in Buffalo. The blacks, I think, are only, I don't know, 20% of Buffalo. But it was over 50% of the people who died in those storms were black. So in other words, you know, now I think one of the things that we've got to do is, I think that people like me, because I'm 82, so I'm not sure it's going to be people like me, but I think people like me have got to sit down and say, okay, how do we reach out to these people? How do we make, I mean, the point is, we don't want to do bad things. I mean, take Obamacare. If anything helped these people, it was Obamacare. But as you know, the southern states, Alabama, Florida, they haven't done it. Why? I can tell you why. Because they don't want blacks to get it. They would rather that blacks didn't get it than that they got it. I mean, we've got all sorts of statistics showing exactly that. I mean, really showing exactly that. And certainly, have I sent you my book on hate, Why We Hate? Did I send that to you? Yes or no?
To me?
No, well, yes. Did you know, you people get a copy of my book on hatred?
Yeah,
No, I don't.
I have it.
Yeah, because you'll see, I talk about exactly those sorts of things in that book. These are the sorts of, so it doesn't mean to say that some of us aren't starting to think about it. But I think what we've got to do is sit down and take it a hell of a lot more seriously. We've got to say, okay, what do we do to reach out? I mean, one thing I would like to do is, and some are doing this, I would like to see community colleges have a much bigger role, free and that sort of thing. Because one thing that the pandemic has shown us is that we are in desperate need of people at the low level of healthcare. That, you know, old people's home. I mean, look, you don't have to be a fancy nurse to go into an old people's home and to realize that for somebody of my age, it's not as easy as it was when I was 20. I cannot carry a barbecue from one end of the garden to another. And of course, as it happens, I'm not incontinent yet, but there's an awful lot of people who basically need their bottoms wiped. And I think that we could do an awful lot of getting people who don't have jobs down at that level and get them involved in that sort of work. And, you know, it's not just slog. It's worthwhile work. So you spend your day and you say, you know, it's hard and it's difficult, but you know, I've got the training, I can do it, and I know that what I'm doing is worthwhile. So there would be a place where, if I were in charge, I would be pushing so hard for free community college and opening up community colleges and reaching out to people and saying, look, you don't have to spend 2 years doing calculus. Maybe you could do it over 1 or 2 years, but you could be doing hands-on all the time, and then, as it were, once a month, have a week or something of training, and then go back to do it again. I think we could do, but of course the other thing is, at the end of it, you give them a diploma. You give them a diploma, and you make them. You've got to make people feel worthwhile. You've got to make people feel wanted. You've got to make people feel that they're part of the group. It doesn't mean that they necessarily want to make as much money as you, because they didn't when they were, working for Ford. But you've got to make them feel that they are being rewarded, and that this is something which is worthwhile, and that this is something that they can look each other in the face at the end of the day and say, my God, wasn't Iago a pain in the butt? I mean, Iago, we have to wipe his bottom 3 times a day. No, Walter, I think it's Walter. But at the end of the day, you laugh about it. You laugh about it and say, but the thing is, Iago isn't a bad guy. In fact, Iago is really quite a nice chap. It's just that he's overwhelmed by his incontinence. Once we can help him get on top of that, then I find talking to Iago is really rather a lot of fun. He's really quite an interesting guy, and he did a lot of travel. He's got all sorts of stories he can tell us about, going to Brazil and going to the Grasso Falls. I mean, I come from Ontario, where we had the Niagara Falls, and the Grasso Falls. They just blew me away. They really, truly blew me away. I mean, I also like the Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, but I'm into falls. But as I say, so I think what we've got to do is try to make those working class people who lost their jobs, give them work and make it feel worthwhile. Not just, you're going to do this, you're going to, sweep the floors. No, give them a job. And as we saw in the pandemic, oh my God, didn't we see how desperately we need people like that who are going to go in and help in old people's homes and that sort of thing, and help to keep them running, help to keep them worthwhile. So as I say, if I were, starting again, or if I were, a politician, that sort of thing, that I think it's not good enough just to sit on your bottom and say, oh, isn't it a bad thing? You've got to say, okay, it's a bad thing, but how do I make these people realize that there is something in life, that life is worthwhile? And once we got them doing that, then we can set them up so they get medical care, so they get proper holidays, so they get good retirement funds. So as I say, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I'm not negative in the sense that I think there's nothing that we could do. Now, as I say, I don't know to what extent what I'm talking about applies to Brazil, and I'm sure you people have a better idea. But certainly what I'm talking about applies both to North America and to England. I mean, talk about stupid. Talk about absolutely stupid. But who were the people who voted to leave? It was the working class. It was the people who are not doing very well out of it. And they wanted to say, oh, I hate the fucking French. Let's get on and, as we do. I mean, so anyhow, so that's my solution. Anyhow, folks, it's 5:50 and I'm getting to the point where that's it. Why we hate. That's it. Yes, that's it. Yeah. Okay. Now, listen, if there's anything I can do to say, not just you two, alpha males, but others, if there's any, I mean, I've got most of my books on PDF, and I would be very happy to send you copies. Funnel it through Iago or somebody, funnel it through these guys, and they'll give me your address and what you want and that sort of thing. But if there's anything I can do like that, I'm only too willing to do it.
Thank you so much, Professor Ruse. Well, I think it's enough for today, and we again thank you so much for accepting this invitation, and we hope me and Iago and the others to continue this talk and our conversations.
Well, as I say, I'd be very happy to do something again, in 2 or 3 months or something like that. I'm sorry, you'll notice I'm coughing a lot, Believe it or not, I've got COVID at the moment, but I'm not somebody who lets something like COVID stop me from doing something like this. I mean, there are things which are important, and this for me is tremendously so. Okay, folks.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. It has been an honor.
I'll see you again.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, guys.
See you. Thank you, you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. I don't know how to shut it off, but I'm sure it will.